Tune in every Tuesday for High Society with your host, David Malmo-Levine, here on Pot TV. Welcome to another edition of High Society. My name is David Malmo-Levine. I'm your host, and today's show consists primarily of relating what we know about refugees, refugees to Canada, and specifically setting up our own drug peace refugees or cannabis refugee safe house here in Canada. We set up a website. It's called Underground Reefer Railway website. It's at www.undergroundrailway.ca. This is a home page. We have some nice quotes about helping other people here, and when we get to this quote, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." That's from Harriet Tubman, one of the more famous Underground Railway conductors, who basically helped escaped slaves in the United States come up to Canada and achieve freedom. We have a couple of clips on that subject, and we're going to show them to you right now.
Slaves escaped to freedom along a series of trails known as the Underground Railroad. The railroad was a loose network of people willing to hide runaway slaves in their homes and conduct them to the next station or safe house until they could reach the free North. The Underground Railroad was also aided by Northern abolitionist organizations such as the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, who gave supplies and helped conduct slaves to freedom.
The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee was a very important group engaged in aiding fugitive slaves. It was a group that had operated from the late 1830s into the early 1840s, and it was comprised of fugitives as well as free blacks and white supporters. It was a group that aided the Underground Railroad, and their primary job was to aid fugitives with food and clothing and money, and to direct them on to other places.
Pursued by angry slave masters and bounty hunters, the route for escaped slaves was perilous and hard. Many did not survive the hardship or were caught and returned to their masters. The most famous guide on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. Having escaped from a Maryland plantation in 1849, she became familiar with the roads, hiding places, and depots that were used to conduct runaways to freedom in the North.
Harriet Tubman was a brave, courageous, wise, and kind person. Not only did she concern herself about her liberty, but she concerned herself about people of all races. As you know, one reason why the Underground Railroad is so popular among people throughout the world is that people of all races, creeds, and colors came together.
Tubman's method relied on secrecy and surprise. She would gather money and supplies in the North, then slip down to the eastern shore through Delaware and into Maryland, arriving unannounced until the last moment. She would make contact with the slaves who were ready to escape.
She would simply appear on the eastern shore, and the word would be quickly spread to all of those who were determined that they would be free, where they should meet her at the appointed hour. And of course, those who chose freedom met her there and embarked with her on the trek to freedom. After she learned from her first venture that she could not trust slaves to determine that they were going to drop out, she packed a revolver, and for those who determined that they were going to turn around, she told them, "Go forward or die."
To avoid suspicion, Tubman sang traditional slave spirituals to relay coded messages to slaves.
She stole away into the night and crept along the various slave quarters or cabins, oftentimes whispering or knocking on doors and more or less singing steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. I ain't got long to stay here, was a coded spiritual informing the slaves to steal away.
Having gathered her flock, Tubman would travel at night and conduct them to Delaware or Pennsylvania. She used only the most trusted contacts and safe houses along the route of the Underground Railroad. One such key station on the Underground Railroad was Johnson House in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Owned by Quakers, Johnson House was a safe haven for exhausted runaway slaves. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act intensified the risk for runaway slaves. Under federal law, any Negro accused of being a runaway could be returned to slavery by the sworn statement of the slave's owner. Northern states that had been safe for fugitive slaves became dangerous as runaway slaves were hunted for reward. To be safe, Tubman extended her Underground Railroad trail to St. Catharines, Canada, a town near Niagara Falls.
Walk together, children, walk together, children. Don't become weary. We're going to make it to the promised land. I have shoes, you have shoes, all God's children have shoes. When you get to heaven, going to put on their shoes and walk all over God's heaven. Heaven was the code word for Canada.
I hope you like those clips on slaves. We have a couple other examples of legitimate refugees for you. Our next quote is from John Dos Passos, a left-wing writer and Jew from 1940. He writes, "Our only hope will lie in the frail web of understanding of one person for the pain of another." And to our shame, and to the shame of the United States government, we didn't do all that we could have done to help the Jews. There were some religious groups, such as the Quakers, who would also help the escaped slaves, and they helped some of the Jews escape Nazi Germany. But a lot of the time, the governments of the United States and Canada were very resistant to Jews coming across, even not allowing some Jews who had their visas already done into the country when they felt that it would open the floodgates, so to speak. So we have a couple of quotes and a couple of clips on that topic for you as well, what the Jews were running from and what they ran into.
When the Nazi Party came to power in the 1930s and began passing anti-Jewish laws, the Carliners tried to live quietly and hoped the madness would pass. Herbert Carliner's father, Joseph, had fought for Germany in the First World War. He owned a thriving store in Glivitz, and the family lived above the store. On Kristallnacht in November 1938, he was one of thousands of Jews arrested and taken to concentration camps. Most Jews were allowed out of the camps only if they would agree to leave Germany within 6 months. As the ship hovered off the Florida coast, newspapers across the United States and around the world began to pick up the story.
The German liner St. Louis with Jewish refugees aboard, 918. The refugees sailed to Cuba, but were denied admission. Suspense, terror, and pity.
The St. Louis was becoming famous, but the American government was unrelenting.
The Depression was still underway. Fear of economic deprivation for those that were working, loss of jobs, competition. And we got to realize that in 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for re-election, and he did not want to go out of his way to make political enemies out of any group, and therefore it was the most expedient thing to do was to turn away 937 innocent people and let them suffer the fate.
It is as if the St. Louis had vanished from the world and now had to leave this hostile planet. Only the children remained carefree on this voyage. They only took their faith seriously in their games. They have invented a game called Jews Are Not Allowed, where two boys looking strict and official stood at a barrier and examined their friends wishing to enter. Two small boys ask harshly, "Are you a Jew?" as the other merely says yes. They reject him strictly. Jews are not allowed to enter. The reply, "Oh, but I am only a small one."
The passengers' last hope for sanctuary in North America was Canada. The Canadian government of the day was led by Prime Minister Mackenzie King, whose private diary included concerns that too many Jews were moving into his Ottawa neighborhood. The Prime Minister referred the St. Louis request to his hardline Deputy Immigration Minister, Frederick Blair. In rejecting the St. Louis request, Blair wrote that no country could open its doors wide enough to accommodate the Jews leaving Europe. The line, he said, must be drawn somewhere.
For the 1939 residents of West Branch, Iowa, this gravel lane served as the main route into town. But to European refugees trying to escape Hitler's tyranny, the dusty Iowa road was a path to safety.
Basically, we're talking about Schindler's List on the prairie. The only difference is that everyone in the world knows about Oskar Schindler and the 1,100 Jews he saved in Middle Europe. Almost no one knows about the 185 refugees that Iowa Quaker farmers and college kids saved.
From 1939 to 1943, nearly 200 refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe found a safe haven at Scattergood Hostel, a makeshift commune on the site of what had been a Quaker boarding school. Here, outside the small town of West Branch, Iowa Quakers hosted Jews as well as Hitler's political dissidents, offering them food, shelter, and a glimmer of light in the midst of Nazi darkness.
Admittedly, 185 is a drop. Well, it's not even a drop in the bucket compared to 6 million people who perished at Auschwitz and Treblinka and all the other death camps. But 185 souls saved was more than what was being saved down the road. I mean, this story is a story, a remarkable story, of Iowa Quaker farmers and college students who had no connection with these people, had no obligation, and in many cases couldn't even correctly pronounce their names, but brought them over from Berlin and Prague and Vienna and Budapest and saved their lives. If the Quakers had not saved them, they would have all been killed at Auschwitz and gone up the chimney as ashes. But because of the bravery of some people, their lives were saved. People pretty much like you, actually.
For author Michael Lewitt-Trans, the Scattergood story is an example of goodness during a time of hatred. A rarity in world history he feels compelled to share with everyone he can, from Quaker congregations to these Des Moines high school students.
If you were a refugee, where would you go? Where would you find help? Who would help you? Most people don't do anything in most areas of their lives to actively, ongoingly help someone else. You know, life is hard as it is. We don't want to be responsible or feel responsible for somebody else, so we turn the other way. Well, during the Third Reich, most people ignored these peoples who were trying to scurry out of harm's way. What's amazing is that the Iowa Quakers didn't. Like with getting to know a person, the more that you get to know about Scattergood Hostel, the more you realize this is exciting, this is life-changing. If I involve myself in this, if I invest my heart, not just my head, but my heart in this story, it will change me.
For Michael, pictures of Scattergood offer a glimpse into just how unique the hostel really was. In fact, you'd swear these to be snapshots of a peaceful family farm rather than images of a wartime refugee camp.